His Excellency, the Honourable Alex Chernoff, Governor of Victoria and Mrs Elizabeth Chernoff, the Right Honourable Malcolm Fraser, former Prime Minister of this country, and Mrs Tammy Fraser, Mr Carrillo Gantner, nephew of the late Kenneth Myer and Mrs Zian Gantner, Mrs Neilma Gantner, sister of the late Kenneth Myer, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. My name is Geoffrey Donnan. I'm Director of the Florey Neuroscience Institutes, and welcome to the 15th Kenneth B. Myer Lecture. This is the second one we've held here at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre. The Kenneth B. Myer Lecture is in honour of Kenneth Myer, who is the founding president of the Howard Florey Institute. The lecture was established in 1995, 3 years after his untimely death. The object of the lecture is to honour the memory of Kenneth Myer, but as well as that to bring to the Australian public science in a lay form. This is an important role, we think, for an institute such as ours in a modern, sophisticated and what we think is a clever society. The lecture today is to be delivered by Professor David Attwell, as you've seen in the advertisement. David trained as a physicist in Oxford before switching to study physiology and nerve and muscle, which is a common path, I must say. David then worked on the retina in Berkeley, California, before returning to the UK, where he became an academic at the University College London, where he became an academic becoming the Jodrell Professor of Physiology. He's a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and also of the Royal Society. David's well known for his work on brain energy use and how the brain uses electrical signals to think, how you and I think, and providing a better understanding of the cellular events leading to nerve damage in conditions such as stroke. So it's very appropriate tonight that the title of his lecture is indeed Brain Power. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, could I introduce Professor David Attwell.
Thanks, Jeff. Can you hear me at the back with the microphone? So, Ken Myer made exceptional contributions to Australian society, both in the arts and the sciences. He helped to fund the Florey Institute, which is promoting this lecture. He served the government as an economist, and he promoted funding of the arts by the state of Victoria. He even modernised the National Library of Australia. And his philanthropy lives on in the form of the Myer Foundation. So he was a truly great Australian, and it's an honour to be chosen to give this lecture in his name. Now, if we could have the lights down, please. The title of my lecture today is Brain Power, and I'm going to be using this phrase in two separate ways, but as we'll see, they're related. I'm going to use brain power to mean our brain power, how incredibly clever we are, how we can do cognitive tasks really quickly. But I'll also use brain power to reflect the energy supply to the brain, its power source. Because as we'll see, the brain's brain power depends critically on its power supply. So the brain is a bit like a computer, and you'll be aware that if you turn off the computer on your desk, if you remove the plug from the wall, then it stops working. And the brain is a bit similar. It needs a constant supply of energy in the form of glucose and oxygen, which, as we'll see, are provided in the blood. Otherwise, bad things happen to the brain. So let's have a look at a human brain. This is one here. You can see the folds of the cerebral cortex, the most recently evolved part of the brain. And when it's turned over, you'll be able to see the bottom of the brain here where the spinal cord would go off to control our arms and legs. Now, this few pounds of meat is what we perceive the outside world with when we look with our eyes or listen with our ears. We think with it. All of our thoughts are generated within this organ here. It controls our muscles to let us move through the world. We fall in love with it. It holds our deepest fears, but also our highest hopes. So this is what makes us truly human. And in the next 45 minutes, I want to tell you something about how this organ works, but also how it's powered. So the theme running through my lecture is that our brain power depends absolutely on the power supply to the brain. So I want to start out by showing you an example of the cognitive powers that a brain is capable of. We use our brains every day to do different things cognitively. If you want to cross the road in Melbourne, you're constantly assessing whether there are buses and trams coming, that kind of thing. And you need your brain to work quickly to be able to navigate that task safely. Now here's an extreme example of this from the Star Wars movies. For those of you who are either too old or too young to remember Star Wars, this is Anakin Skywalker, who turned out to be a Jedi Knight, and we'll see him in his Jedi Knight phase later. But here he is at the age of 6, carrying out a difficult cognitive task, slightly more complicated than crossing the road in Melbourne. And he's in a race, pod racing, against his arch-enemy Zabulba. Now, that wasn't Anakin dying, and we'll come back to Anakin later, because we'll see that Anakin's cognitive powers, the Jedi Knights, as some of you will be aware, had what was called the Force, and the Force was what allowed him to navigate this course so cleverly. We'll see later that the Force is related to the powering of the brain. So let me just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about in my lecture. I'm going to start out with birth and end up with death with the aid of Superman, and go through a number of interesting themes in between. So I'll first of all look at how much energy brains use, and I'll then look at how they evolved to be able to use energy so efficiently to do information processing quickly. With the aid of Superman's monster, I'll try to convince you that the brain uses electrical signaling to provide us with our cognitive powers. And then I'll look more scientifically at how nerve cells use electrical voltage changes to encode information. I'll show you that this encoding of electrical signals in neurons is really important with the aid of these South American Indians and a really vicious snail. And I'll then come back to Anakin to explain where the energy comes from to power our very clever thoughts. And in fact, the energy is generated by these little creatures which live within us. Getting towards the end, I'll show you that we can look inside the living brain, image our thoughts, if you like, using the fact that the glucose and oxygen has to be increased to generate more energy from these little creatures. And at the end, in the tragic part of my talk, with the aid of Superman, I'll consider some diseases which occur to the brain when its power supply is cut off. So let's start out with birth. I want to introduce you to Tony. As you can see, Tony, who is the son of a PhD student of mine, is a voracious eater, and here he is knocking back his favorite tipple, and he cries a lot if he doesn't get this. And the reason he wants so much of it is to power his impressive cranium. So it turns out that 60% of Tony's food goes to power his brain. So kids' brains use a lot of energy. What about adults? Well, here's a typical adult with their brain fixated on the things that all of us are fixated on. And it turns out that for Homer, just like for us, his brain is about 2% of his body's mass. But his brain uses 20% of his resting energy. So as you're sitting here in the audience, 20% of the meals you've eaten today are being used to power your brain. Now, of course, Homer is resting all the time, so that means that 20% of his donut intake goes to power his brain. So the important thing to come out of this is that the brain uses a disproportionate amount of energy that the body produces. Okay, so thinking is very energy intensive. How much energy does the brain actually use? Well, it's about the same as a 20-watt light bulb. That's a rather dim light bulb of the old sort, or about what you get with one of these newfangled low-energy light bulbs. So that's how much energy is being used in your brain all the time. Let's compare that with another computational device, the computer on your desk. The computer on your desk uses about 10 times as much energy as your brain. Now, the computer on your desk is better at some tasks, a small number of tasks. In particular, if you want to search through long lists of things, like when you're doing a Google search to find a piece of information, then the computer's very good at that. But the computer thinks far less than our brains do. It's far less good at doing complicated tasks, like, for example, recognizing your granny no matter what angle you see her from. We find that extremely easy. Trying to program a computer to do that is much harder. So the energy use of the brain is high compared to other parts of the body. I want to look now at how our brain evolved to be able to use so much energy. And I want to look at brain evolution not over the time scale of the dinosaurs, which is of the order of 100 million years, but just over the last 4 million years as we evolved from the lower primates. Now, as we evolved from the lower primates, our bodies got bigger and our brains got bigger as well. So here's some brains from different species. This is a rat brain, a rhesus monkey brain, a chimp brain, and a human brain. And you can see as the bodies of these animals get bigger, so do their brains. The dolphin brain, interestingly, is even bigger, but I'm not going to talk about that today. But it turns out that you can extrapolate from the lower primates, extrapolate up to our body size, and try to predict how big our brain should be. And when you do that prediction, anthropologists have concluded that our brain is 3 times larger than you'd predict for our body size. And this is why we're so clever compared to the other species. So the larger brain is going to use 3 times more energy as well. You've got 3 times as many cells in there thinking powerfully. They're going to use 3 times more energy. So if the brain is going to use 3 times as much energy, then something must have evolved to use less energy, to be more efficient. And anthropologists have concluded, and I'll show you the data for this in a minute, that what evolved to use less energy is the gut. So here's their data. What these anthropologists did was to try to predict for humans how big the different organs should be by starting with the lower primates and extrapolating upwards for body size. And they predicted the brain ought to be about 400 grams in weight, whereas in fact our brain is about 2 kilos in weight. It's about 1,200 grams in weight, so it's 3 times bigger. For the gut, they predicted it should be about 2 kilos in weight, but in fact our gut only weighs just over 1 kilo. So the gut has got much smaller and more energy efficient. And we'll come back to why that is in a minute. The other organs all had about the size that they predicted. So these anthropologists suggest that what's happened is, over the last 4 million years, primate brains, ending up with ours, have got larger and use more energy by virtue of the fact that the gut has evolved to get more efficient and get smaller. So how is it that the gut can get more efficient? Well, it's thought that there are 2 contributions to this. I apologize to the vegetarians in the audience to start with. It turns out that part of this is thought to result from a higher nutrition diet with less leaves and more meat, which presents at least protein to the gut in a more readily digestible form. And the other thing that may contribute to this is a cultural change, the discovery of fire and the introduction of cooking, which again presents food to the gut in a way which allows it to be digested with using far less energy. So overall then, the gut got smaller and more efficient, and that allowed the brain to use more energy, which let us have many more neurons, nerve cells, so we can think more cleverly. Now, what do we use this energy on? How does the brain actually think? I want to introduce this subject with the aid of Dr. Frankenstein's monster, and we'll come back to him in a minute, but the theme is I want to persuade you that the brain uses electricity to think, just like computers do, in fact. So let's just briefly review a few facts about electricity. You may remember that Benjamin Franklin, one of the founding fathers of America, found that if he flew a kite into a thunderstorm and the string of the kite got wet and he had a key at the bottom of the kite, he could point it at the ground and electricity would arc from the end of the key to the ground. This is obviously a rather dangerous way of obtaining electricity, and he was lucky to survive, but he went on and did great things. Now, 30 years later, a much safer form of electricity had been invented, the battery, in Italy, and Galvani showed that if you took a battery and applied its voltage across the leg of a frog which had recently been killed, then when the voltage is applied to the frog's sciatic nerve, the leg twitches like this, okay? It twitches. So putting electricity into the frog animates it in some way. Not to be outdone, his nephew, 20 years later, applied this same technique to the recently beheaded bodies of criminals. And he found that if they'd been sufficiently recently beheaded, then again, applying electricity to their nerves would make their bodies twitch, and if he was lucky, they would rear up off the operating table in a satisfying manner. People would scream and faint, and he made a vast fortune exhibiting this to the general public. But the important scientific fact he'd discovered was that electricity animates humans. And this was carried to its logical conclusion with Mary Shelley's book, in which, and this is a clip from a still from the 1931 film with Boris Karloff. In this book, Dr. Frankenstein took a dead body, here's the dead body, with a dead brain transplanted into it, and with the aid of his faithful dwarf assistant, he raised this body into the path of an oncoming thunderstorm, and when it was up there, the brain was struck by a bolt of lightning, the body was brought back down, and as it started to move, in the movie you hear Dr. Frankenstein saying, "It's alive, it's alive." So again, electricity animates humans. So doubtless you've been convinced by these cultural suggestions, but I now want to just show you one more thing about this, which is that this idea of a spark of life animating people was actually a much older idea. When Michelangelo painted the roof of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, he depicted God here passing the spark of life into Adam. Now, we don't know whether Michelangelo was thinking about electricity, but we do know he was thinking about the brain, because it's been pointed out that if you look at this depiction of God here with all the putti around him, this is remarkably similar to the structure of the human brain. It's with God's legs being the spinal cord going off down here. This is for real. His shoulders here and this leg forming this band of fibers joining the two halves of the brain, the so-called corpus callosum. And the putti are the folds of the cerebral cortex, and even this apparently randomly placed scarf traces out the path of one of the blood vessels going to the brain. So what was he doing when he painted this ceiling? It may be that he thought, or he was trying to portray the fact that God needs to animate the brain of humans to bring them alive, or more subversively, it's been suggested he was playing a joke on his patron, the Pope. The Pope was extremely annoyed with Michelangelo because he was taking years to paint the bloody ceiling, 4 years, in fact. And so it's been suggested that he was trying to convey the fact that the idea of God is created in the brains of humans. Be that as it may, it's clear that over the centuries there have been a strong cultural suggestion that electricity is what animates humans. Now I want to explain in rather more scientific detail how nerve cells use electricity to send information and to encode our thoughts. So here's a picture of some nerve cells. This is from a little bit at the back of the brain called the cerebellum, which controls our smooth movements. And here the nerve cells present have been labeled with different dyes so that you can see their structure. So if we look at nerve cells like this, we find they have two ends. They have an input end, which has this tree-like structure and receives lots of inputs from other nerve cells. And they then have an output end, the so-called axon, which sends out information to another nerve cell or to a muscle. So let's see how these cells encode information and pass it from one cell to another. I've just redrawn the nerve cell. This is its input end, and this is its output end. And if we zoom in on the membrane of the nerve cells are composed of a kind of plastic bag, this blue stuff, the membrane, which separates two compartments. There's salty water outside the cell, and there's a different kind of salty water, where the salt is based on potassium, not sodium, inside the cell. And if you were to put a little voltmeter inside the cell, you'd find there's a negative voltage there, about -1/10 of a volt normally, that kind of size. And when the nerve cell gets excited, this voltage goes positive, which I'm going to represent by this little star, and that positiveness opens up little holes in the membranes, which are made by proteins, which have got a charge on a gate like this, so it's pushed open, and that allows more sodium to come in. Na means sodium. That opens the next gate, more sodium comes in, and here's the next one, more sodium goes in. And so in this way, an electrical signal spreads along the axon. And if you plot out a graph of the waveform of these voltage changes, they're about 1/10 of a volt in amplitude, and each one lasts only about 1,000th of a second. Okay. Now, one of the themes of my lecture is the energy supply to do these kind of things, and it turns out that the energy is used on pumping out these sodium ions, which are mediating the electrical signaling in our brains. And about 1/4 of the energy being used in your brain goes on reversing this influx of sodium ions afterwards, so that you can do another one. Now, I want to show you an example of this electrical signaling, how it works in action when you see things in the outside world. So an electrical signal is going along the nerve cell, making these little spikes of voltage. Now, think about what happens when you're looking at something, as you're looking at the screen now. If you look at something in the outside world, then the eye converts that into an electrical signal, like I've just shown you, and it eventually ends up at the back of your head, the part of the cortex which deals with vision. And I'm going to show you a classical recording of this, in which, in order that we know when the electrical signals are happening, the electrical spikes have been converted to a sound. And this is a movie from two people, Hubel and Wiesel, who got the Nobel Prize for showing how the visual cortex analyzes information coming in from the outside world. Can you hear that? So here they're moving a spot of light across a screen and recording from a neuron, a nerve cell at the back of the brain, and then mapping out exactly where it responds. So it responds between these lines. You can see it likes it to go in one direction. This was recorded from the brain of an anesthetized cat, so you might imagine this cell is trying to detect little white mice moving in that direction. And Hubel and Wiesel showed that the visual cortex is designed to look for little spots of movement like this, but also for bars of light moving and for corners of light. And by having cells which respond to these increasingly complicated stimuli, you build up a picture of the outside world in each little part of the visual world, which lets you know what's going on in the visual world. You can see this cell doesn't respond so well to bars. It likes spots much better. So this is the cellular basis of perception, if you like. It's these electrical signals within the nerve cells which allow us to see the outside world. So I've told you about what happens with a signal going along one nerve cell, but when it gets to the end of the nerve cell, what's going to happen then? Well, it turns out that there are gaps between nerve cells called synapses, and the information goes across the gap by virtue of the nerve cell releasing what's called a neurotransmitter, which typically in the brain is glutamate. That's monosodium glutamate, like you eat in Chinese food or use as meat tenderizer. So this stuff gets puffed out, and it then excites the next cell. Now, how does it do that? If we look in detail at this gap between the cells, when an impulse arrives along here, it releases the glutamate, which binds to a little protein, the so-called glutamate receptor, and opens a hole that positive charge goes into and excites the next cell. And this is how information goes from one nerve cell to another, and we'll see why it's important in a minute. Then, all these positive charges have to be pumped back out again, and it turns out that these use about 50% of your brain energy. So the great majority of energy used on signaling in the brain goes on these synapses. Now, what's the use of this? Well, it turns out that most of our thinking, if you like, occurs at these gaps between the synapses. And here's a nerve cell which is receiving input from 2 other neurons. Now, let's suppose you're hungry. You didn't eat before you came to the lecture. So there's a nerve cell somewhere in your brain saying, I'm really hungry. Okay, and it's sending information down here, but maybe the amount of glutamate released at that synapse is not enough to excite this other neuron. Similarly, there may be someone in the audience who isn't hungry, but who's got a bar of chocolate in their pocket, and they've got a neuron that's got that information encoded, and it's being sent down the nerve cell, but it doesn't release enough glutamate to excite the next cell. But for the person in the audience who's hungry and has chocolate in their pocket, they're in luck, because the information going down both of these nerve cells may produce enough release of glutamate to excite the next cell and produce a novel behavior. You remove the chocolate from your pocket and eat it. Now, this is a trivial example, obviously, because there are only 2 nerve cells involved. But typically, the nerve cells in your brain receive about 30,000 inputs from other nerve cells, and they add and subtract them, and on the basis of the signal that's produced, they decide whether to start a new behavior or not. So you can see from the number of synapses impinging on each nerve cell, there's a lot of scope for complicated thoughts going on there. And so from what I've told you so far, most brain energy, about 3/4 of it, is used on pumping out the ions that mediate signaling going along the nerve cells, that's 25%, and between nerve cells, that's about 50%, like that. So this signaling underlies all of our thoughts. So I want to give you an example of this for movement. I've shown you how you perceive things with the movie of the visual cortex. I want to turn now to how you initiate a movement. Now here's a movement. I couldn't resist showing this. This happens so rarely that it had to be mentioned. But this is, this is the last Australian batsman being bowled out in the last Ashes. Now, when a movement like this is initiated, it starts off in the top of your head, in the motor cortex. And so what happens is a nerve cell up there gets excited, and it sends information down your spine, where it goes across a gap in the way I've just told you, and excites another nerve cell, which goes out, for example, along your arm to where you're holding the bat. And another neurotransmitter is released and makes the muscle contract to try to hit the ball with the bat. So do these ion movements matter? I've been going on and on about electrical movements in the brain, and I've been trying to persuade you that this is how you perceive things and how you move. I want to try to convince you with a couple of examples now that these movements really matter.